What if one of America's most trusted allies in Asia suddenly decided to pivot? What if Singapore, a nation often described as small in size but massive in influence, chose to step back from its long-standing partnership with the United States? It sounds unlikely, even unthinkable. But in today's shifting global landscape, where alliances are tested, interests evolve, and power dynamics are constantly reshaped, no partnership is immune to stress. In this video, we're going to explore 3 scenarios, real, unfolding, and quietly building, that could fracture the US-Singapore relationship. And the third one? It's not a prediction. It's already happening. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you might see this strategic partnership in a whole. Scenario 1. The rise of a US-China Cold War 2.0 in Southeast Asia. Imagine this scenario. A new US-China Cold War emerges in Southeast Asia, a region where economic influence, military power, and geopolitical positioning are crucial. The tension between the US and China has steadily grown in recent years, and now the rivalry escalates into a full-blown ideological and economic standoff. Trade wars intensify, the militarization of the South China Sea accelerates, and cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and sanctions become everyday tools in this new global conflict. At the center of this global conflict is Singapore, a country that has long maintained its position as a neutral, strategic player in the Southeast Asian region. Known for its strong economic ties with both the US and China, Singapore has been able to thrive by positioning itself as a bridge between these two superpowers. But as tensions rise, Singapore's ability to walk the fine line between Washington and Beijing becomes increasingly difficult. The question becomes, can Singapore continue to stay neutral in the face of mounting pressure from both sides? And what happens if it's forced to make a choice? U.S. interests in Singapore. For decades, the United States has viewed Singapore as a vital partner in the Indo-Pacific region. The U.S. relies heavily on Singapore as a military and economic ally, using it as a key naval base for operations in the region. The U.S. Navy's access to Changi Naval Base in Singapore is crucial for maintaining a strong military presence in Southeast Asia, particularly in countering China's growing influence in the South China Sea. Additionally, Singapore serves as a financial hub where U.S. corporations and banks have long established strong ties, helping to advance American economic interests in Asia. In short, the U.S. sees Singapore as a critical ally in its broader strategy of maintaining dominance in the region and containing China's growing power. China's influence on Singapore. At the same time, China views Singapore as an important partner in its Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, a massive infrastructure development project aimed at expanding China's influence across Asia and beyond. Singapore plays a crucial role in facilitating trade routes and financial flows between China and other parts of Southeast Asia. The city-state is also a significant player in China's push for greater technological cooperation in areas like green energy, AI, and digital infrastructure. China's deepening economic ties with Singapore are hard to ignore. As China's economic influence continues to grow, Singapore's role as a trading partner becomes even more critical. The Chinese market is enormous, and Singapore acts as a gateway for Chinese companies looking to expand their presence in Southeast Asia. For Singapore, the economic benefits of partnering with China are undeniable. The dilemma for Singapore. Now imagine a situation where the US and China reach a breaking point, where the rivalry escalates from trade disagreements to full-on geopolitical competition. As the US places increasing pressure on its allies to pick a side in the growing standoff, Singapore finds itself at a crossroads. On one hand, Singapore has long benefited from its close relationship with the US, which has provided both military security and economic advantages. But on the other hand, its deepening ties with China could put it in a difficult position. If the US continues to view China as a strategic threat, Singapore's continued cooperation with China may begin to be seen as a betrayal of its long-standing relationship with Washington. For example, if the US ramps up sanctions or trade restrictions against China, Singapore might be forced to choose between complying with Washington's demands or continuing to nurture its lucrative economic relationship with China. Similarly, as the US looks to limit China's military influence in the region, Singapore's continued partnership with China in areas like the South China Sea or tech development could be viewed as problematic. The fallout for Singapore. If Singapore chooses to continue its close relationship with China, the fallout with the U.S. could be significant. The U.S. may begin to reconsider its security and military commitments in Singapore, such as limiting access to Changi Naval Base or pulling back on intelligence sharing agreements. For a country like Singapore, which relies on strong defense ties with the U.S., this could be a massive blow to its security strategy. Furthermore, U.S. companies with a presence in Singapore, many of which are major players in sectors like finance, technology, and healthcare, might reconsider their operations. If the U.S. perceives Singapore as too closely aligned with China, businesses may start to shift their investments elsewhere in the region. On the other hand, if Singapore chooses to align more closely with the U.S., it risks alienating China, which could impact Singapore's access to Chinese markets and participation in China-led initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative. China might impose economic or trade sanctions, or it could seek to reduce its cooperation with Singapore in favor of other countries in the region. A delicate balancing act. Singapore's neutrality has always been a key part of its success. Its ability to engage with both the U.S. and China without taking sides has allowed it to maintain its position as a regional hub for trade, finance, and technology. However, as the U.S.-China rivalry heats up, Singapore's ability to maintain that delicate balance may be increasingly challenged. If forced to choose, Singapore's decision could reshape its role in the region and its future relations with both superpowers. Ultimately, Singapore's response to a U.S.-China Cold War 2.0 will be about more than just picking sides. It will be about finding a way to maintain its economic prosperity and security while navigating the complexities of a changing global order. The stakes are high, and the decisions Singapore makes in the coming years will determine its future in the Asia-Pacific region and beyond. Scenario 2. A political shift in Malaysia redefines regional alliances. Picture this. Malaysia undergoes a dramatic political transformation. A newly elected coalition, more populist, nationalistic, and critical of Western influence, sweeps into power with a strong mandate. Their agenda? A Malaysia that prioritizes domestic economic protectionism, reclaims control over foreign investments, and reconsiders long-standing diplomatic alignments, especially with the US, UK, Australia, and even Singapore. This shift doesn't happen in isolation. It's fueled by growing public frustration over rising living costs, perceived inequality from foreign ownership of local industries, and skepticism toward global institutions. Suddenly, policies that once encouraged open trade and foreign partnerships are reversed. Impact on regional diplomacy and Singapore. Singapore, which has long relied on stable relations with its northern neighbor, finds itself in a tricky situation. The new Malaysian government begins re-evaluating deals, port access, water agreements, and cross-border infrastructure like the Johor-Singapore Rapid Transit Link. What was once a routine diplomatic understanding now becomes a tool for leverage. The sentiment in Malaysia? We're tired of being second to Singapore. It's time we prioritize Malaysian interests. Singapore's officials are now on high alert. If these new leaders move to restrict economic cooperation or introduce tariffs and limits on Singaporean businesses operating in Malaysia, it could shake the foundations of a decades-long partnership. Singapore's access to Malaysian resources, labor, and even food supplies could be at risk. Western investors start rethinking Malaysia. Meanwhile, this political turn makes Western investors nervous. US, UK, and Australian businesses that have long used Malaysia as a regional hub begin to reconsider. With trade protections tightening and regulations becoming unpredictable, many start shifting their base of operations to Singapore, a country still seen as politically stable, economically open, and globally connected. Suddenly, Singapore isn't just benefiting from regional uncertainty, it's becoming a haven for capital fleeing Malaysia. The bigger picture. ASEAN tensions rise. This scenario doesn't just affect Malaysia and Singapore, it has ripple effects across ASEAN. Countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam begin to wonder, is Malaysia turning away from the West a warning of what might come in their own politics? China, ever watchful, steps in with promises of increased investment and infrastructure partnerships in Malaysia. The narrative becomes clear. Malaysia is realigning. And in this shift, China finds an ally willing to challenge the U.S.-led influence in the region. Singapore's role in the storm. For Singapore, the challenge is now threefold. 1. Maintain economic and political stability while dealing with a less cooperative neighbor. 2. Protect trade routes, supply chains, and bilateral agreements that are suddenly under threat. 3. Reaffirm its role as the region's most reliable, stable partner for Western allies, and increasingly for other ASEAN countries looking for leadership amid chaos. The pressure is mounting. If Malaysia drifts too far from its Western ties and regional cooperation frameworks, Singapore will need to recalibrate fast to remain the region's strategic anchor. Scenario 3. U.S.-China tensions escalate, Singapore caught in the crossfire. Imagine this. The rivalry between the United States and China hits a boiling point. A sudden incident in the South China Sea, say a naval standoff or cyber attack, ignites international headlines. Both nations begin reinforcing military positions in the Indo-Pacific. Sanctions are introduced. Tech and data become battlegrounds. And for countries like Singapore, neutrality is no longer an option. It becomes a high-stakes balancing act. Why Singapore is in the hot seat? Singapore has always walked a fine line between its deep economic ties with China and its strong strategic partnership with the United States. But as pressure builds, both superpowers begin demanding loyalty. Washington expects support on defense, tech access, and regional security. Beijing, in turn, warns against siding with the West, threatening trade consequences and diplomatic distance. Singapore's position as a global financial hub, tech node, and logistics center suddenly becomes a vulnerability. U.S. companies operating in Singapore start pushing for stronger government alignment with Western sanctions. At the same time, Chinese firms and banks warn of divestments if Singapore appears too pro-American. Critical infrastructure becomes politicized. Singapore's ports, data centers, and even its world-renowned Changi Airport are now at the center of geopolitical chess. The U.S. asked to expand intelligence sharing and joint military exercises hosted on Singaporean soil. China responds by rerouting trade through more sympathetic ASEAN countries and cutting Singapore out of key Belt and Road projects. This isn't just theory. Singapore's strategic location makes it a natural prize in any economic or military struggle in Southeast Asia. And both Washington and Beijing know it. The fallout, businesses, defense, and the everyday citizen. Western media headlines begin portraying Singapore as Asia's Switzerland, being pulled into a global war of influence. Global companies start hedging. Will Singapore remain a safe haven, or will geopolitical risk catch up? The Singapore armed forces are placed on high alert. The government tightens cyber defenses and begins contingency planning for disruptions in trade routes, especially those passing through the South China Sea. Everyday citizens start seeing higher prices, delayed imports, and growing unease over Singapore's role in a regional conflict. ASEAN divides deepen. Meanwhile, ASEAN unity frays. Countries like the Philippines and Vietnam lean toward the U.S., while Cambodia and Laos draw closer to China. Singapore, once a diplomatic bridge in the region, is under increasing pressure to take a side, something it has spent decades avoiding. Singapore's diplomatic gamble. To defuse the crisis, Singapore initiates high-level talks, offering to host summits between Washington and Beijing. It proposes a new ASEAN-led neutrality pact focused on trade, digital sovereignty, and maritime peace. But whether either superpower listens is another matter entirely. This scenario ends with a critical question. Can Singapore stay neutral and relevant in a world where picking sides is no longer optional? None of these scenarios are fiction. They're already forming beneath the surface. Trade disputes, military pacts, digital surveillance frameworks, and behind-the-scenes diplomacy. These aren't future threats. They're present dynamics. And if even one of them breaks through, the U.S.-Singapore alliance could face its most serious test in decades. Singapore, despite its size, is more than just a dot on the map. It's a strategic command post, an economic lifeline, and a soft power amplifier in the Indo-Pacific. But it also sits at the crossroads of two competing world orders. The question isn't if tensions will rise, it's when and how far they'll go. Will Singapore continue to navigate these troubled waters with precision? Or will it be forced to choose a side, potentially reshaping its economy, diplomacy, and identity? What happens next doesn't just matter to Singaporeans, it matters to the world. Conclusion: Singapore stands at a crossroads. The choices it makes in the coming years, whether to lean more heavily toward the US, balance the growing pressure from China, or chart its own independent course, will have ripple effects far beyond Southeast Asia. To Washington, Singapore is a gateway to Asia. To Beijing, it's a model of efficiency and influence worth watching, or winning over. And to Singaporeans, it's home, a nation trying to remain sovereign in a world that keeps demanding allegiance. In this new era of shifting alliances, data diplomacy, and economic decoupling, the question is no longer, will Singapore stay neutral? The question is, can it afford to? Call to action. What do you think? Is Singapore walking a tightrope too thin to hold, or has it mastered the art of balance in a divided world? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from voices across Singapore, the US, Malaysia, the UK, Canada, and Australia. And if you found this eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow World Without Borders for more sharp insights into the global moves shaping your future. Because the world is changing fast.